Take a look at this old silver maple. This is probably 6 to 8 feet in diameter. And I'm not 100% sure, but considering it's growing next to this very historic old house, I'd guess it may, in fact, be of similar age, although it's really hard to tell. When it comes to trees of this size, especially ones that are planted sort of landscape, it's really hard to discern what age they are without cutting them down or doing some kind of core sample. The main question is whether this tree grew originally in a forest that was cut down around it, or whether it grew in open ground. Trees that grow out in the open tend to grow wider versus trees in forests, which tend to grow taller. And unfortunately, as old and impressive as this tree is, in my personal opinion, it's on its way out. And I wanted to talk about that for a second. Now, obviously, this isn't my tree, so I don't really have much of a say in it. But if it were, I would suggest it be cut down. Obviously, that may be an unpopular opinion, but I think in this case it's warranted, and I'll explain why. Now, it is fair to question this. Obviously, the tree is still alive, and for such an impressive tree, cutting its life short doesn't really seem like the right thing to do. But trees don't live forever, and they are reasonably hazardous when they're on their way out. First, let's talk about why I think this tree is on its way out. You see all these branches? That's quite a lot. There's just branches falling all over the place, and this is a lot for one tree. And if you look up at the top canopy, you can see why. It's not a horror story by any means, but it's not great. And if you look further down, you can actually see the tree responding to this. These are called water spouts. They are nowhere near as old as the tree would be at that height. If these branches had grown when the tree needed them there, they would be absolutely massive. These branches are maybe a few years old. When trees are stressed, often from disease or damage, they will sprout from lower down, and these growths are not as strong and they're not as useful. They are still useful. They produce leaves that photosynthesize, but it's a lot like scar tissue. It's not really supposed to be there, and it's an indication that something has gone wrong. And as for the last thing, it's pretty clear that the most recent invasive on the block, the spotted lanternfly, really likes this tree. So yes, this tree is probably on its way out, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should cut it down. Trees die all the time, and they are a very useful part of the ecosystem when they do. The problem is, this is a landscape tree. It's not part of a forest ecosystem, and especially in this case, there is literally a historic monument right next to it. One look at the fence will tell you that falling branches have already caused damage to less essential parts. But if one of those main branches that are sitting over the roof were to fall, it could cause serious damage. So this tree is a very good example of an answer to the question of why would you ever cut down a tree? Isn't that wrong? Doesn't that hurt the environment? Well, in many cases, on a large, massive scale, yes. But there are trees that should be cut down. There is such a thing as responsible forestry. This tree has done an incredible job of surviving this long, and honestly, if it were my tree, I'd probably want to crack it open and see its work. I'd be willing to bet you could make some beautiful things that will last for centuries from the center trunk of this tree. I would be legitimately surprised if everyone agreed with me on this. As always, it's a judgment call. Of course, this is just an example. It's not my tree, so it's not my decision. But if it were, here's the dilemma I would be facing. Would I leave this tree alone, knowing that it's likely it will soon wither and die, and potentially damage this piece of history? Or would I cut it down, knowing I may have prematurely, by a reasonable amount, ended its life, but also likely preserving a piece of history, and the wood that it worked so hard to create, perhaps even giving it a second life? And if so, maybe this little baby eastern red cedar will grow to be just as big. The answer is pretty clear to me, but as always, it's a judgment call. I do hope you've learned something, enjoyed. And as always, I wish you the best. Till next time.